Section 16 of Inca Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomko. Inca Lands by Hiram Bingham, Chapter 9, Part 2. Thus, in 1545, the reign of an attractive and vigorous personality was brought to an abrupt close. Manco left three young sons, Sayri Tupac, Titu Cusi, and Tupac Amaru. Sayri Tupac, although he had not yet reached his majority, became Inca in his father's stead, and with the aid of regents reigned for 10 years without disturbing his Spanish neighbors or being annoyed by them, unless the reference in Montesinos to a proposed burning of bridges near Albuquerque, under date of 1555, is correct. By a curious lapse, Montesinos ascribes this attempt to the Inca Manco, who had been dead for 10 years. In 1555 there came to Lima a new viceroy, who decided that it would be safer if young Sayri Tupac were within reach instead of living in the inaccessible wilds of Uilcapampa. The viceroy wisely undertook to accomplish this difficult matter through the Princess Beatrix Coya, an aunt of the Inca, who was living in Cuzco. She took kindly to the suggestion and dispatched to Uiticos a messenger of the blood royal, attended by Indian servants. The journey was a dangerous one. Bridges were down and the treacherous trails were well-nigh impassable. Sayri Tupac's regents permitted the messenger to enter Uilcapampa and deliver the viceroy's invitation, but were not inclined to believe that it was quite so attractive as appeared on the surface, even though brought to them by a kinsman. Accordingly, they kept the visitor as a hostage and sent a messenger of their own to Cuzco to see if any foul play could be discovered, and also to request that one John Sierra, a more trusted cousin, be sent to treat in this matter. All this took time. In 1558 the viceroy, becoming impatient, dispatched from Lima Friar Melchior and one John Betanzos, who had married the daughter of the unfortunate Inca Atahualpa and pretended to be very learned in his wife's language. Montesinos says he was a great linguist. They started off quite confidently for Uiticos, taking with them several pieces of velvet and damask and 2 cups of gilded silver as presents. Anxious to secure the honor of being the first to reach the Inca, they traveled as fast as they could to the Chuquichaca Bridge, the key to the valley of Uiticos. Here they were detained by the soldiers of the regents. A day or so later, John Sierra, the Inca's cousin from Cuzco, arrived at the bridge and was allowed to proceed, while the friar and Betanzos were still detained. John Sierra was welcomed by the Inca and his nobles, and did his best to encourage Sayri Tupac to accept the viceroy's offer. Finally, John Betanzos and the friar were also sent for and admitted to the presence of the Inca, with the presents which the viceroy had sent. Sayri Tupac's first idea was to remain free and independent as he had hitherto done, so he requested the ambassadors to depart immediately with their silver gilt cups. They were sent back by one of the western routes across the Apurimac. A few days later, however, after John Sierra had told him some interesting stories of life in Cuzco, the Inca decided to reconsider the matter. His regents had a long debate, observed the flying of birds and the nature of the weather, but, according to Garcilaso, made no inquiries of the devil. The omens were favorable, and the regents finally decided to allow the Inca to accept the invitation of the viceroy. Sayri Tupac, anxious to see something of the world, went directly to Lima, traveling in a litter made of rich materials, carried by relays chosen from the 300 Indians who attended him. He was kindly received by the viceroy, and then went to Cuzco, where he lodged in his aunt's house. Here his relatives went to welcome him. I myself, says Garcilaso, went in the name of my father. I found him then playing a certain game used amongst the Indians. I kissed his hands and delivered my message. He commanded me to sit down, and presently they brought 2 gilded cups of that liquor, made of maize, chicha, which scarce contained 4 ounces of drink. He took them both, and with his own hand he gave one of them to me. He drank, and I pledged him, which, as we have said, is the custom of civility amongst them. This ceremony being past, he asked me, why I did not meet him at Uilcapampa. I answered him, Inca, as I am but a young man, the governors made no account of me, to place me in such ceremonies as these. How, replied the Inca, I would rather have seen you than all the friars and fathers in town. As I was going away, I made him a submissive bow and reverence, after the manner of the Indians, who are of his alliance and kindred, at which he was so much pleased that he embraced me heartily, and with much affection, as appeared by his countenance. Sayri Tupac now received the sacred red fringe of Inca sovereignty, was married to a princess of the blood royal, joined her in baptism, and took up his abode in the beautiful valley of Yucay, a day's journey northeast of Cuzco, and never returned to Uiticos. His only daughter finally married a certain Captain Garcia, of whom more anon. Sayri Tupac died in 1560, leaving two brothers, the older Titu Cusi Yupanqui, illegitimate, and the younger, Tupac Amaru, his rightful successor, an inexperienced youth. The throne of Uiticos was seized by Titu Cusi. The new Inca seems to have been suspicious of the untimely death of Sayri Tupac, and to have felt that the Spaniards were capable of more foul play. So, with his half-brother, he stayed quietly in Uilcapampa. Their first visitor, so far as we know, was Diego Rodriguez de Figueroa, who wrote an interesting account of Uiticos, and says he gave the Inca a pair of scissors. He was unsuccessful in his efforts to get Titu Cusi to go to Cuzco. In time there came an Augustinian missionary, Friar Marcos Garcia, who, 6 years after the death of Sayri Tupac, entered the rough country of Uilcapampa, a land of moderate wealth, large rivers, and the usual rains, whose forested mountains, says Father Calancha, are magnificent. Friar Marcos had a hard journey. The bridges were down, the roads had been destroyed, and the passes blocked up. The few Indians who did occasionally appear in Cuzco from Uilcapampa said the friar could not get there unless he should be able to change himself into a bird. However, with that courage and pertinacity which have marked so many missionary enterprises, Friar Marcos finally overcame all difficulties and reached Uiticos. The missionary chronicler says that Titu Cusi was far from glad to see him and received him angrily. It worried him to find that a Spaniard had succeeded in penetrating his retreat. Besides, the Inca was annoyed to have anyone preach against his idolatries. Titu Cusi's own story, as written down by Friar Marcos, does not agree with Calancha's. Anyhow, Friar Marcos built a little church in a place called Puquiura, where many of the Incas people were then living. He planted crosses in the fields and on the mountains, these being the best things to frighten off devils. He suffered many insults at the hands of the chiefs and principal followers of the Inca. Some of them did it to please the devil, others to flatter the Inca, and many because they disliked his sermons, in which he scolded them for their vices and abominated among his converts the possession of 4 or 6 wives. So they punished him in the matter of food and forced him to send to Cuzco for victuals. The convent sent him hardtack, which was for him a most delicious banquet. Within a year or so another Augustinian missionary, Friar Diego Ortiz, left Cuzco alone for Uilcapampa. He suffered much on the road, but finally reached the retreat of the Inca and entered his presence in company with Friar Marcos. Although the Inca was not too happy to see a new preacher, he was willing to grant him an entrance, because the Inca thought Friar Diego would not vex him nor take the trouble to reprove him. So the Inca gave him a license. They selected the town of Huarancalla, which was populous and well located in the midst of a number of other little towns and villages. There was a distance of 2 or 3 days' journey from one convent to the other. Leaving Friar Marcos in Puquiura, Friar Diego went to his new establishment and in a short time built a church, a house for himself, and a hospital, all poor buildings made in a short time. He also started a school for children and became very popular as he went about healing and teaching. He had an easier time than Friar Marcos, who, with less tact and no skill as a physician, was located nearer the center of the Inca cult. The principal shrine of the Inca is described by Father Calancha as follows: close to Vitcos, or Uiticos, in a village called Chuquipalpa, is a house of the sun, and in it a white rock over a spring of water where the devil appears as a visible manifestation and was worshipped by those idolaters. This was the principal mochadero of those forested mountains. The word mochadero is the common name which the Indians apply to their places of worship. In other words, it is the only place where they practice the sacred ceremony of kissing. The origin of this, the principal part of their ceremonial, is that very practice which Job abominates when he solemnly clears himself of all offenses before God and says to him, "Lord, all these punishments and even greater burdens would I have deserved had I done that which the blind Gentiles do when the sun rises resplendent or the moon shines clear, and they exult in their hearts and extend their hands toward the sun and throw kisses to it, an act of very grave iniquity, which is equivalent to denying the true God." Thus does the ecclesiastical chronicler refer to the practice in Peru of that particular form of worship of the heavenly bodies which was also widely spread in the East, in Arabia and Palestine, and was inveighed against by Mohammed as well as the ancient Hebrew prophets. Apparently this ceremony of the most profound resignation and reverence was practiced in Chuquipalpa, close to Uiticos, in the reign of the Inca Titu Cusi. Calancha goes on to say, "In this white stone of the aforesaid House of the Sun, which is called Yurak Rumi, meaning in Quichua a white rock, there attends a devil who is captain of a legion. He and his legionaries show great kindness to the Indian idolaters, but great terrors to the Catholics. They abuse with hideous cruelties the baptized ones, who now no longer worship them with kisses, and many of the Indians have died from the horrible frights these devils have given them." One day, when the Inca and his mother and their principal chiefs and councilors were away from Uiticos on a visit to some of their outlying estates, Friar Marcos and Friar Diego decided to make a spectacular attack on this particular devil, who was at the great white rock over a spring of water. The two monks summoned all their converts together at Puquiura, in the church or the neighboring plaza, and asked each to bring a stick of firewood in order that they might burn up this devil who had tormented them. An innumerable multitude came together on the day appointed. The converted Indians were most anxious to get even with this devil who had slain their friends and inflicted wounds on themselves. The doubters were curious to see the result. The Inca priests were there to see their god defeat the Christians, while, as may readily be imagined, the rest of the population came to see the excitement. Starting out from Puevura, they marched to the Temple of the Sun in the village of Chuquipalpa, close to Uiticos. Arrived at the sacred palisade, the monks raised the standard of the cross, recited their orisons, surrounded the spring, the white rock, and the Temple of the Sun, and piled high the firewood. Then, having exorcised the locality, they called the devil by all the vile names they could think of to show their lack of respect, and finally commanded him never to return to this vicinity. Calling on Christ and the Virgin, they applied fire to the wood. The poor devil then fled, roaring in a fury, and making the mountains to tremble. It took remarkable courage on the part of the two lone monks thus to desecrate the chief shrine of the people among whom they were dwelling. It is almost incredible that in this remote valley, separated from their friends and far from the protecting hand of the Spanish viceroy, they should have dared to commit such an insult to the religion of their hosts. Of course, as soon as the Inca Titu Cusi heard of it, he was greatly annoyed. His mother was furious. They returned immediately to Puquiura. The chiefs wished to slay the monks and tear them into small pieces, and undoubtedly would have done so had it not been for the regard in which Friar Diego was held. His skill in curing disease had so endeared him to the Indians that even the Inca himself dared not punish him for the attack on the Temple of the Sun. Friar Marcos, however, who probably originated the plan and had done little to gain the good will of the Indians, did not fare so well. Calancha says he was stoned out of the province, and the Inca threatened to kill him if he ever should return. Friar Diego, particularly beloved by those Indians who came from the fever-stricken jungles in the lower valleys, was allowed to remain, and finally became a trusted friend and adviser of Titu Cusi. One day a Spaniard named Romero, an adventurous prospector for gold, was found penetrating the mountain valleys, and succeeded in getting permission from the Inca to see what minerals were there. He was too successful. Both gold and silver were found among the hills, and he showed enthusiastic delight at his good fortune. The Inca, fearing that his reports might encourage others to enter Uilcapampa, put the unfortunate prospector to death, notwithstanding the protestations of Friar Diego. Foreigners were not wanted in Uilcapampa. In the year 1570, 10 years after the accession of Titu Cusi to the Inca throne in Uiticos, a new Spanish viceroy came to Cuzco. Unfortunately for the Incas, Don Francisco de Toledo, an indefatigable soldier and administrator, was excessively bigoted, narrow-minded, cruel, and pitiless. Furthermore, Philip II and his Council of the Indies had decided that it would be worth while to make every effort to get the Inca out of Uiticos. For 35 years the Spanish conquerors had occupied Cuzco and the major portion of Peru without having been able to secure the submission of the Indians who lived in the province of Uilcapampa. It would be a great feather in the cap of Toledo if he could induce Titu Cusi to come and live where he would always be accessible to Spanish authority. During the ensuing rainy season, after an unusually lively party, the Inca got soaked, had a chill, and was laid low. In the meantime, the viceroy had picked out a Cuzco soldier, one Tilano de Anaya, who was well liked by the Inca, to try to persuade Titu Cusi to come to Cuzco. Tilano was instructed to go by way of Ollantaytambo and the Chuquichaca bridge. Luck was against him. Titu Cusi's illness was very serious. Friar Diego, his physician, had prescribed the usual remedies. Unfortunately, all the monk's skill was unavailing, and his royal patient died. The remedies were held by Titu Cusi's mother and her councillors to be responsible. The poor friar had to suffer the penalty of death for having caused the death of the Inca. The third son of Manco, Tupac Amaru, brought up as a playfellow of the Virgins of the Sun in the temple near Uiticos, and now happily married, was selected to rule the little kingdom. His brows were decked with the scarlet fringe of sovereignty, but, thanks to the jealous fear of his powerful illegitimate brother, his training had not been that of a soldier. He was destined to have a brief, unhappy existence. When the young Inca's councillors heard that a messenger was coming from the viceroy, 7 warriors were sent to meet him on the road. Tilano was preparing to spend the night at the Chuquichaca bridge when he was attacked and killed. The viceroy heard of the murder of his ambassador at the same time that he learned of the martyrdom of Friar Diego. A blow had been struck at the very heart of Spanish domination. If the representatives of the vice-regent of heaven and the messengers of the viceroy of Philip II were not inviolable, then who was safe? On Palm Sunday, the energetic Toledo, surrounded by his council, determined to make war on the unfortunate young Tupac Amaru, and give a reward to the soldier who would effect his capture. The council was of the opinion that many insurrections might be raised in that empire by this young heir. Moreover, it was alleged, says Garcilaso, that by the imprisonment of the Inca all that treasure might be discovered, which appertained to former kings, together with that chain of gold which Huayna Capac commanded to be made for himself to wear on the great and solemn days of their festival. Furthermore, the chain of gold with the remaining treasure belonged to his Catholic Majesty by right of conquest. Excuses were not wanting. The Incas must be exterminated. The expedition was divided into 2 parts. One company was sent by way of Limatambo to Curahuasi, to head off the Inca in case he should cross the Apurimac and try to escape by one of the routes which had formerly been used by his father Manco in his marauding expeditions. The other company, under General Martin Hurtado and Captain Garcia, marched from Cuzco by way of Yucay and Ollantaytambo. They were more fortunate than Captain Villadiego, whose force, 35 years before, had been met and destroyed at the pass of Panticalla. That was in the days of the active Inca Manco. Now there was no force defending this important pass. They descended the Lucumayo to its junction with the Urubamba and came to the bridge of Chuquichaca. The narrow suspension bridge, built of native fibers, sagged deeply in the middle and swayed so threateningly over the gorge of the Urubamba that only one man could pass it at a time. The rapid river was too deep to be forded. There were no canoes. It would have been a difficult matter to have constructed rafts, for most of the trees that grow here are of hard wood and do not float. On the other side of the Urubamba was young Tupac Amaru, surrounded by his counselors, chiefs, and soldiers. The first hostile forces which in Pizarro's time had endeavored to fight their way into Uilcapampa had never been allowed by Manco to get as far as this. His youngest son, Tupac Amaru, had had no experience in these matters. The chiefs and nobles had failed to defend the pass, and they now failed to destroy the Chuquichaca bridge, apparently relying on their ability to take care of one Spanish soldier at a time and prevent the Spaniards from crossing the narrow, swaying structure. General Hurtado was not taking any such chances. He had brought with him one or two light mountain field pieces with which the raw troops of the Inca were little acquainted. The sides of the valley at this point rise steeply from the river, and the reverberations caused by gunfire would be fairly terrifying to those who had never heard anything like it before. A few volleys from the gun and the arquebuses, and the Indians fled pell-mell in every direction, leaving the bridge undefended. Captain Garcia, who had married the daughter of Sayri Tupac, was sent in pursuit of the Inca. His men found the road narrow in the ascent, with forest on the right, and on the left a ravine of great depth. It was only a footpath, barely wide enough for two men to pass. Garcia, with customary Spanish bravery, marched at the head of his company. Suddenly, out of the thick forest, an Inca chieftain named Hualpa, endeavoring to protect the flight of Tupac Amaru, sprang on Garcia, held him so that he could not get at his sword, and endeavored to hurl him over the cliff. The captain's life was saved by a faithful Indian servant who was following immediately behind him, carrying his sword. Drawing it from the scabbard with much dexterity and animation, the Indian killed Hualpa and saved his master's life. Garcia fought several battles, took some forts, and succeeded in capturing many prisoners. From them it was learned that the Inca had gone inland toward the valley of Simaponte, and that he was flying to the country of the Mañaries Indians, a warlike tribe, and his friends, where balsas and canoes were posted to save him and enable him to escape. Nothing daunted by the dangers of the jungle nor the rapids of the river, Garcia finally managed to construct 5 rafts on which he put some of his soldiers. Accompanying them himself, he descended the rapids, escaping death many times by swimming, and finally arrived at a place called Momori, only to find that the Inca, learning of their approach, had gone farther into the woods. Garcia followed hard after, although he and his men were by this time barefooted and suffering from want of food. They finally captured the Inca. Garcilaso says that Tupac Amaru considered that he had not people to make resistance, and that he was not conscious to himself of any crime or disturbance he had done or raised, suffered himself to be taken, choosing rather to entrust himself in the hands of the Spaniards than to perish in those mountains with famine or be drowned in those great rivers. The Spaniards in this manner seizing on the Inca and on all the Indian men and women who were in company with him, amongst which was his wife, 2 sons and a daughter, returned with them in triumph to Cuzco, to which place the Vice King went, so soon as he was informed of the imprisonment of the poor prince. A mock trial was held. The captured chiefs were tortured to death with fiendish brutality. Tupac Amaru's wife was mangled before his eyes. His own head was cut off and placed on a pole in the Cuzco Plaza. His little boys did not long survive. So perished the last of the Incas, descendants of the wisest Indian rulers America has ever seen. Brief summary of the last four Incas. 1534, the Inca, Manco, ascends the throne of his fathers. 1536, Manco flees from Cuzco to Uiticos and Uilcapampa. 1542, promulgation of the new laws. 1545, murder of Manco and accession of his son Sayri Tupac. 1555, Sayri Tupac goes to Cuzco and UK. 1560, death of Sayri Tupac. His half-brother Titu Cusi becomes Inca. 1566, Friar Marcos reaches Uiticos, settles in Puquiura. 1566, Friar Diego joins him. 1568 to 9, they burn the House of the Sun at Urac Rumi in Chuquipalpa. 1571, Titu Cusi dies. Friar Diego suffers martyrdom. Tupac Amaru becomes Inca. 1572, expedition of General Martin Hurtado and Captain Garcia de Loyola. Execution of Tupac Amaru. End of section 16. Recording by William Tomko.